right, we're going to try to do a few things today. First thing I want to do is go over Chapter 18. There will not be a homework based on that. All right. Then when we're done, I'm going to talk about Chapter 25, which is the Model View Controller. There will not be a homework on that. All right. If there's any time left, and we'll see what it is, I'm going to start to get into talking about Git. So those of you who know Git might be bored for the last hour. Sorry about that. But if you don't, and I know a few of you said you hadn't done anything with it, so we will go over some of that. Tomorrow, when you get in here, we're going to try, and I'm going to do it at home tonight first to make sure I have no problems with it, to build a very simple entity framework database and basically have it all set up with us. And then we're going to build it in stages, and as we do each stage, we're gonna push it to Git. All right, really to GitHub. All right, so we're going to do that. If there's extra time tomorrow, then we'll start on the next project, which will be a little bit more complex than the first one we do. Is not going to have very much in it, but it's just to get you going. And with the second one, we're not going to do it with the first, but with the second one, we're going to build a very simple system with a database, and then when we get done, we're going to port that out to Azure. All right. And then when we get done with that, well, let's just see where we are. All right. That'll get us at least through this week. To my knowledge, Ms. Zika will be back again on Friday. All right. So I'm on Chapter 18. I'm on page 639. Let me just tell you that part of this chapter, at least, it's a little bit dated. Plus, some of the stuff that they ask you to do in here, we're going to do it more using wizards. Because I could have a whole class on how to use LINQ. It is that complex of a subject. So we're going to do almost nothing with it. I'm going to explain it to you. You will have a chance to see some of its syntax. I would say that if it is the end of the semester or next spring and you're out looking for a job and you're offered a job as a ASP.NET programmer, maybe you think I wouldn't do that, but you never know. But if you are and they ask you if you've got a lot of experience using LINQ, I'd say if you were going by this class, I would tell them no. All right, but that's your call. So it says, up until now, we've used data source controls to bind data from a database to a data control. In this chapter, we'll learn to use the entity framework and model binding to bind data directly to a control. So when you look on here, we will talk first on how to create an entity data model. Then we will talk about LINQ to entities. Then we will talk about model binding, look at a product list application, how to use model binding for CRUD operations. All right, then look at a product maintenance application, and finally end up with talking about how to use data annotations to validate data. That's kind of cool. That's like those we saw last time, if you remember. We looked at, called them attributes, that above your code you put stuff in brackets. All right, you're going to see that in here, but you can actually do some validating by putting the stuff in brackets. For instance, if you want to say that the the amount sold has to be between 1 and 50, you can actually put that in there as a rule. And I'm not talking about using a required field validator or a compare validator. I'm talking about doing it right in the code. All right, so how to create an entity data model. Typically, it's referred to as EF. It is part of ADO.NET, which is ActiveX Data Objects.NET. As it says here, its goal is to address the mismatch that often occurs between the table structure of a relational database and the objects used in an application. You may or may not have heard of the topic or the concept of many databases that are being created today are not relational anymore. In fact, they're referred to as NoSQL databases. There are packages out there like MongoDB, and there are other ones, but they are meant to handle things that are not standard. When you look at it, with all the work that we've done with databases, basically everything we've done has been a tabular structure. It has been a table. Now, that works fine for what we're doing, as far as I know, for the economic development counsel, but that doesn't always work fine for everything that people are doing, period. For instance, let's assume for a second that we wanted to create a database. And in that database, what we wanted to put in there was, let's just say that we were an author. And we wanted to put in different chapters from books or whatever, and that doesn't work well with a database. It just, the way that it's set up, it is not. But you can make it work fairly seamlessly by using one of the NoSQL databases. All right, I'll just leave it at that. So they mentioned, turning up to page 641, that the easiest way to create an entity data model is to use the entity data model wizard. All right, it says to start this wizard, you can do add new item, and then you can just choose it. All right, when you look in here, you'll notice what happens. All right, so the first thing that you'll notice right away is it's empty data model wizard. It is going to be more wizard driven. It's going to look different than the stuff we've done previously. All right, so as you can see that in here we've got EF Designer from databases, EF Designer model, EF Code First model, and Code First from database. And especially I want you to look at those last two choices. We're not going to basically do much in the way that they're doing it here, but you've got your choice when you are working with the entity framework model. You can either create your database first and then link it to your program, or you can create your program first and then have it basically build the database for you. We're going to do both, just so you know. All right? But we're going to start by having our own database. We're going to build a very simple database tomorrow with 2 tables in it, but we're not going to put any records in it. All right? Then we're going to set it up using the Model View Controller framework, and what you're going to notice is once we do that and you bring up your page, it's going to be basically a database-driven website, because what you're going to see on the different pages are options where you can click, for example, create, and boom, it brings up your database structure on the page. And it lets you add records to it. And as soon as you add those records and save them, they're going to be saved to the actual database itself. Again, we'll start going through that tomorrow. All right. So you come through the Entity Data Model Wizard, and as you go through there, we've seen this before, as it says, what data connection should you apply. There's nothing new there. All right. So the second step that you see that's taking up most of your screen right now, this lets you specify the database connection you want to use, just like we've already seen. It's got a drop down. In this case, we're using the built-in one, the Halloween database. Otherwise, you can create your own. So again, looking at that, it doesn't look very different from what we've looked at before. And then we come in and we choose the version, and we choose the data objects rather. And it doesn't look that different to you. All right, it probably doesn't. But what we've done in the past, I think everybody would agree if you look up on the screen here, we've chosen one of these tables, or maybe more of these tables, but typically a table. We click on it, and then we choose the fields that we want, and it builds an SQL statement for us. We're not doing that now. We're working with the table as a whole. All right, that's the big thing when you use the entity framework. You just grab the entire table. All right, it may not sound like a big thing, but it really and truly is. And you'll notice in here, typically you'll want to use whatever the newest one is. And in this case, and I think it's going to be the same for us, Entity Framework 6.x. In fact, there's no guarantee that it will be downward compatible. So in other words, if you choose Entity Framework 6.x and you try to do something later in Entity Framework 5.0, it probably won't work. It should work the other way, but the reason that you choose the latest and greatest is it's got the most features and the most functionality. All right. There are some checkboxes here. They may or may not look like they're that big a thing, but you'll notice in here it says pluralize or singularize generated object names. All right. And if you look in here, these are all plural. They all end with S. All right. So a lot of times what you're going to do is you are going to leave that checked, because what that's going to do is it's going to end up writing some code for us. It'll end up creating a class for us. Now, since this is called categories, typically, since it's plural, the class will be singular. So the class will be named category, okay? And whatever fields are in the categories table are automatically going to be created for you in the category class. And they'll have just a get and a set. All right? And again, you'll see that kind of stuff as we go on. All right? Then the next check that you see there says include foreign key columns. And again, when you're trying to do things like bind things together, it's better to have that relationship specified. All you're doing by checking that is you're telling the system, hey, if you find any of these relationships, take advantage of it. All right? Don't just pretend they're not there, for lack of better words. All right? The last one wouldn't probably mean much to us because the import selected stored procedures and functions, that's assuming you've written some of your own standard procedures and functions. We haven't been doing that. So that one won't matter as much. All right? But you'll probably typically do it anyway. All right? Finally, when you click that finish button, you might see some security warnings. Occasionally that's going to come up. All right? And it's because what happens is, and you'll see this in the next slide in just a minute, there are some files that are going to be created for you from the entity framework, and these files end with a .tt extension. All right? And the system doesn't know what TT stands for an extension. So what it's thinking is, is there an error in there? It's trying to warn you that it's an unknown file extension. And basically what it's saying is, do you know what you're doing? All right? And usually you can just disregard it. All right? When you go through this, what it does is it brings up something similar to what you see right here. All right? This is an example of an entity data model in the Entity Data Model Designer. An entity for a database, all right, typically most people equate an entity to a noun. You know what a noun is from school. It's a person, place, or thing. However, an entity can also be a concept. It might not be something you can physically touch, like a person or a place or a thing. All right? So it could be conceptual in nature. So when you complete the Entity Data Model Wizard that we just looked at, the Entity Data Model is displayed in this designer. All right? This is trying to show you what you're working with in more of a graphical format. Okay? If you want to put this into the Solution Explorer, I mean, you can actually double click on this, and when you double click on it, it's basically, I don't even know how to describe it. We'll have to take a look at it. All right, we'll do it in just a bit. So each table or view that's in here is represented by an entity class, and each foreign key is represented by what's called an association. So the system knows, taking a look here, that there is a one-to-many relationship between category and product. All right? It can tell. It's got the one here and it's got the many side over here. All right? Now, that's all fine and dandy, but then it, and that may seem easy, that may not seem easy, but this, in my opinion, for whatever that is or is not worth, this is where it gets much more complex. And it's when you work with LINQ. LINQ is an acronym that stands for Line Item Queries or Line Integrated Queries, depending on the book that you read. It's really pretty much a Microsoft invention, which says that you can take any collection, whatever it happens to be, and treat it as though it's a database. All right? Which you can't typically do. And what Microsoft ended up doing for that is they ended up creating their own syntax. In fact, if you take a look right here, here's an example of a LINQ query. Notice that right here. var categories equal from C in DB categories order by C.longname select C. That looks almost inverted from the way we typically do things. We would normally, the third statement would be first, the first would be second, and the second would be third. Correct? Because that's true SQL. This is not true SQL. All right, this is working with LINQ. But the idea behind this is you can take anything where you've got this categories in here. It's usually a database, but it doesn't have to be. It could be something as simple as an array. So you can work with an array and deal with it like you would a database. It could be a comma-separated variable file. It could be a lot of different things, all right, that you work with. And again, I am purposely being really, really general with this stuff. All right, I think this, the way that I'm going to do it and the way I'm going to show it to you is going to be much easier for you to understand. At least that's my hope. All right, and you can use this stuff for CRUD operations. Okay, from this, where this, select. All right, so you'll notice there's retrieving a criteria. In other words, we've got a where on there, so we put in some criteria. But you can also go in and it says code that modifies the data in a category row. All right, what are we doing right there? You've seen things similar to this, but what we're doing once we pull this in via link is now we're just saying, hey, take whatever we put in text boxes and copy it over to the associated database fields. All right, and again, you might look and say, okay, I sort of even get this, but why are we using this? Why isn't the stuff we used before good enough? This is more powerful because it is looking at each table as though it's an object. And it's allowing you to do more object-oriented type of things, which you can't do using the other methods that we've talked about thus far. So this is more powerful. All right. So they show you in here, I mean, there's an example of modify. All right, and there's some other examples of doing some other stuff. What can be really important in here, and this is what I was always told when you work with this stuff, is anytime you're working with databases, and I suppose this is something you guys should really keep into account too, the people who are working on the interface, that when you're working with databases, not so much with a select, but if you're going to give the user the ability to insert, update, and delete, you really should be putting your stuff into try-catch blocks. Because sooner or later, somebody, in that case, you know, the case of their company, I would think it's going to be accidentally, but somebody's going to do something wrong. And you don't want it where it locks up the system. All right. In worst case, you want to throw some kind of an exception that, you know, that even says something like, I don't understand what you're trying to do, or please try later, or an unexpected operation occurred. You've seen some of these before. All right. Now, when you work with this stuff by default, okay, you don't have optimistic concurrency. All right. And what that means, remember, with optimistic concurrency, you expect that if you're working on a database and you're working on a record, that no one else is. All right. Which I don't know. They set it up the way they set it up, but I'm not sure why. All right. But you can come in, you can perform those operations, you can add new rows, and when you take a look at it, this doesn't look all that different from what we've done before. This is the code on page 651. So code that creates a new category object. That's the thing. You're working with objects right there. All right, and you're filling up an object, and then you're telling the object, basically, you're letting the system know, oh, this object is connected, correlated with this database. All right, so you're literally filling it up a lot more using code than what we've looked at before. And I bet you loved all that, because now it gets harder, believe it or not. Because now they start talking about model binding to display data on page 652. So the author says, now you're ready to learn how to use the entity classes it generates to bind data directly to the data control like a grid view control. All right, in the topics that follow, you'll see how to use this technique called model binding to retrieve and display data, to filter data, and providing for paging, sorting and paging. That's all fine. The way that I'm going to show you this starting tomorrow is there's even less that you have to do. We're going to be using the true model view controller architecture, where when we go in and we set things up in our models and we set things up in our controllers, much of this will be written for us. All right. I think that that's not only the right way to do it, I think that's more the way that it's being done today. I told Evan at St. Louis that one of the things where this book to me was falling short was First, in their coverage of model view controller, period. Second, some of the stuff they're showing in here is more antiquated. You know, it's funny to say something that's 2 or 3 years old is antiquated, but in the IT world, something that's 2 or 3 years old can be antiquated. All right. All right. So the author says, this is on page 652 and 653, up until now we've used sources, we've used source controls like the SQL data source. We use that for basically chapters 13, 14, 15, and 16. In the last chapter, in chapter 17, we use the object data source. All right. So we use those to bind to a data control like a grid view or whatever. Then we configured those controls with our own commands. So we put in the SQL. All right. Now it says we learn to use model binding, which is a fairly new feature of ASP.NET to bind entity classes like those generated by the EF directly to a data control. So when you take a look in here and we look at this ASPX code, at least probably what you recognize is when you look right here, there is no SQL statement. All right. It's bound via code as opposed to using an SQL statement. So what you end up doing is you set up a class, you bind everything to the class, and the class basically, as you're filling up the class, it writes to the database for you. I don't know if what I'm saying makes sense or not. All right. But the point is, most people like this, especially code heads, because you can be a code person and you can do a lot of database work without knowing a lick about databases. You really don't have to know anything. And that's why a lot of people like this. In the past, when you wanted to work on this and you wanted to use grid views and data controls, etc., you saw that we were writing our own SQL. And if you don't understand SQL, then you're going to be kind of SOL, as they say. All right. So when you use model binding, you bind data controls directly to methods. All right. And when you do that, all right, they give an example here. It says here you can see that the select method property names the method that retrieves things for you. All right. So that's different. Rather than us putting in a select statement, all right, we're going to have a method that we call that's going to go and basically fill the stuff up for us. That's putting it more simplistically than it is. The main benefit of this is it makes it easier to work with the underlying data types. And the other main advantage is what I told you before, that now people who don't know databases can work with databases. And some people would say, well, that's a bad thing, that if you're going to work with databases, you should understand databases. All right. So this is the method that's going to be called. And, you know, again, it's one of those things that's kind of hard to wrap your head around when you first learn about it, because when you look at this, okay, it's using link, but I'd almost say, okay, other than the fact that it's using link, all we're doing is we're taking the SQL statement and we're moving into its own method. Yeah, we are. Okay, but since we're using link, we're able to do a lot more and have a lot more code written for us. All right, that's the bottom line. The other nice thing about this, since it's a Microsoft invention, if you take a look on page 655, what was done here was they added IntelliSense to this. So when you're working on something that's a Microsoft product, typically Microsoft wants to make it as easy for you to understand as possible. In the first example, okay, you can select a value from the item type. All right. It provides IntelliSense to help you select a value for the select method property. So that's a lot of different things that will be done for you. I'm not going to say automatically, but it's more or less where you're going to be able to choose. And I'll tell you what, if I have to write code, or if I have to say it's got to be this one or this one or this one, I like doing it this way, because there's less of a chance I'm going to screw it up. Plus, the system already can tell you what maps with what. All right. Next is on how to filter data, and if you turn up to page, excuse me, page 657, when we used data source controls, we had that thing where we could choose the drop-down list or whatever, and we'd have to say equals, and we'd have equals a control, etc. You can do similar things in here, but it's even more powerful because when you look at some of the stuff that's in here. All right. Now, I'm jumping ahead, but I just want to mention something to you. When we go into Chapter 25, which we will do after the break, two of the biggest differences between using ASP.NET Web Forms, which is what we've been using all semester, all right, and ASP.NET Model View Controller is when you use Model View Controller, remember at the beginning of the semester, we ran, it was that future value program, and then we did a view source, and I showed you this really long thing that was called view state, and I said that's basically keeping track of all your values for you. Well, when you use Model View Controller, view state goes away. There isn't any. All right? And if you remember what we had to do too, we had to check like for is postback. There is none of that stuff in Model View Controller. More of that stuff is handled for you automatically without you having to even worry about it. All right. You can go in and you can add sorting and you can add paging. This shouldn't look very different to you. This is pretty much the same way that we did it for the regular data source controls that we did before, where you had to specify allow sorting equal true. In this case, allow paging equal true. We're setting the page size, and then we're telling what field or fields we want to be able to sort on. So again, like I said, I don't think there's really anything new there. All right. Now, the product list application that's on page 561, this right here. They're building this application for the third time. Okay? The first time they built it was back in Chapter 13, about 200 pages ago on page 472. All right? So we built that very simplistically. Then we went on, and about 50 or 60 pages ago in Chapter 17, we built this application, and we built it using an object data source. Now they're going and they're building the same application yet again, but they're building it, all right, using the entity framework. So when we look in here and we start to look, again, as the author oftentimes does here on page 663, he takes the code that he considers to be the most important, all right, and he puts that in a different color. Well, if we take a look at that code, I'm not even going to bring the program up. You've seen this run twice already. I don't see the real need for that. But when you look at the first thing in yellow, we've got a drop-down list. All right? And if you notice in there, it's got an item type, so it's letting us know basically, but the thing there is that select mode. So that's the actual code that's going to be called. Again, you do not see here any SQL. That's one of the big things when you work with the entity framework. You're going to see an absence of seeing SQL because technically these aren't data sources anymore. The data sources were used to bind SQL to a grid view or a data view or a data control or whatever, but we're not using that now. All right. Next, we've got the grid view, and you see the same kind of thing. You can see there we've got the item type. So this is going to be associated with a category, and when we select it, that's the method that's going to be called. The grid view is going to be connected to the product, and when we select that, that's the method that's going to be called. Other than that, most of the stuff in here is just on sorting. There's no big thing in here. All right, and you'll notice it uses item. Remember how we've been using eval all the time? Eval is used with the data sources. We're not using data sources. So when we want to do a similar type of operation, we use item, dot. All right. The code behind, which is shown on page 665, one thing about this, when you start to use this stuff, what you're going to see is you're going to get a statement like this. Okay, it'll be something, maybe not this one, but one of these statements, and there'll be the squiggly lines underneath it. And the system is telling you, I don't understand what it is you're trying to do. You may or may not have noticed this yourself when you're coding in this stuff, but whether it's green, meaning meaning that it's a warning, or whether it's red, meaning that it's an error, usually what you can do is if something's got the squiggly lines, you can right mouse click on it. When you right mouse click on it, the system will try to give you a hint as far as what's wrong. Sometimes the hints will mean they'll make absolutely no sense. Sometimes it'll be just, hey, if you want to use this, you've got to add an extra using statement at the top of your program. And if you choose that, it'll add the using statement for you. You can still manually type it in. All right. You're going to see this next semester because when we do the Java part, we're going to use Eclipse. And Eclipse has the same kind of self-help built into it. All right, the same type of stuff. Now, when you look in here, notice we've got control string category. Again, we're saying control in here. We're using, again, some of this stuff, some of these helpers or whatever you want to call them, attributes to try to make things easier for the system to understand. All right. Like I said, I'm being general with this stuff. I've worked with it, not in a lot of detail. All right. To me, this is about as hard as this book gets. All right. All right. Next is how to use model binding to update, insert, and delete data. All right. So notice a grid view that displays data and a details view that provides for updates, inserts, and deletes. We have seen a program like this one before. You have done one like this. All right. I would tell you, one thing to kind of be leery of. I have no doubt that you guys could build that for St. Charles County. Is that too hard for them to understand? All right. Now, Ms. Zika might understand that. But if other people are going to use it, is that too hard for them to understand? You may look at it and go, of course not. It's not hard at all. But that's you. And you start to develop a comfort zone when you work with something long enough, or you say, oh, it's kind of like when we did this. All right. Whereas with them, it may be totally confusing to them. All right. All right. If we look in here, on page 669, they show the starting code that's generated for an update method. So if you notice, if you take a look in here, the code for the update and the insert methods use fully qualified names. So it's category dot something. All right. Both the update and the delete methods are defined with a parameter that'll receive a key value. Now notice it says starting code. That means typically this stuff is going to be generated for you. All right, so think about why you'd want to use this. First, as I mentioned, if you don't really have a great understanding of databases. Second, it's going to generate at least starting templates and some code for you. Third, it's going to have IntelliSense support. Fourth, many people are going to find this more intuitive to use than having to worry about wiring up data sources. All right. And they show an example on 671. There's some code. Here's a method that updates a category object, a method that inserts a new category object, etc. We're going to be doing this, but we're not going to be writing hardly any code. All right. The hope that I have is you're going to be like, yeah, if this can be done for me automatically, cool. All right. You have to set it up and you have to wire it up correctly. But the author isn't doing that here, because for whatever reason, the author decided not to talk about model view controller until the very last chapter. So he can't really talk about how to use models views and controllers. We're going to be going through that stuff before we start to go through these examples. So hopefully it's going to make a lot more sense to you. All right. How to handle concurrency and data validation exceptions. Well, you should be able to take a look at that and understand everything that's in there. We've talked about this before, and I just mentioned it to you earlier. Again, the fact that when you're doing database operations that can at least possibly change or attempt to change what's in the database, you really and truly should be thinking about taking this stuff and putting it into try-catch blocks. All right, to me, it just makes sense to do that. So how to use the data access classes with model binding. Again, I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but much of this stuff that you see right here is going to be automated for us. All right. And again, after the break, we're going to talk about, start talking about model view controller. All right. So the next thing that starts on 677 here is this product maintenance application. Again, that should look pretty familiar to you. All right, we have looked at something at least similar to this back in Chapter 15, a couple hundred pages ago, all right, or 100 pages ago, where this is your master basically, and that's the detail. So if I choose Austin Powers, I get all of Austin Powers information, that kind of an idea. Again, the idea though is this one is done. It's still using the grid view for the products on the left-hand side, etc. All right. And it's still working the same way, except that what it's using is it's using ASPX code. So again, you've heard me say this, you've seen this, all right? We're not writing SQL. We are telling the system what methods to call, and we are writing those methods, but we are using link entities to write those methods, all right? I'm just looking at it that with what I hope you get out of this class, that if I spent all the time that this book does going into this stuff, first of all, you'd be totally confused. How do I know that? Because I get totally confused. And if you got somebody totally confused explaining it to you, that's probably not the best way to hear it. All right? It would be very interesting. I didn't go out to Evan's channel, but he's got a YouTube channel also. It would have been interesting to go out and see how he does this. But it is interesting because I sat in his class one day. I actually got permission to go to go into his class, and I wanted to see how he was doing things. And he wasn't doing it much more detailed than I am. There's only so much that we can push at you in 90 days, or whatever the heck it is. However, I guess it's 90 days. And again, maybe you're that good, but I know I'm not. All right, on page 685, they start to go through the product DB class. This is more similar to the stuff that we're going to be looking at, okay? The class has got 3 different select methods in it. The first one that you can see right there is called get product, all right? It's used, get products. There's 3 of them, like I said, all right? So there's get products in right there, all right? It's used to get the products that are displayed in the grid view control. Then there's get product that just displays an individual item. And there's get categories, all right, that returns the categories and they're ordered by long name, okay? So what you end up getting again in here is much more code. Now notice, here's the first time. The productdb.cs file in the models folder. You're going to start to see this in Chapter 25. I'm going to put this in a nutshell, but you're going to get it in more depth and breadth of coverage after the break. In essence, what model view controller is this. All right? The model, in many ways, the model is kind of the heart and soul. It has the data, which is typically going, I'm not talking about the database, but I'm talking about the data, and they're the classes that you use to manipulate the database data. That's the model. The view is the HTML that you want to show the end user. And the controller acts as the go-between between the model and the view. So somebody types in a URL, they hit enter, that goes to the controller. The controller says, hey model, I need this. The model retrieves that, brings it back to the controller. the controller has got to figure out what methods in the view to call so it can be sent back as HTML to the user. All right? I mean, that's it in a nutshell as far as what's going on. All right? And the last thing that's discussed in the chapter here is how to use data annotations to validate data. And this is the last four pages in here. So the author says, instead of deploying an entity data model, all right, you can use a feature from the entity framework that's called code first development. And we are going to do both of these. We're going to do the database first, and then write the code, and then we're going to write the code and do the database. Everybody hear that? All right, and hold me to that, because you'll learn to do it, hopefully at least, both ways. And it's not like you're going to be like, well, that's not in our book. That's okay. We're going to be doing this as a class. We're going to walk through it very, very slowly. I'm more concerned that you understand it than I am. I've got 6 things. We got to do all 6 or I'm not happy. If I've got 6 things and we do 3, but you understand all 3, I don't have a problem with that. All right? So, on the bottom half of page 689, they mention how to create a code-first model from an existing database. All right? You select the code-first database option that's in here. There it is. All right? Right there. All right? Then you select the connection and the database objects you want to use. So it's very similar to what we looked at before. But before, we had a database and we were generating the code. Now we want the code and we want it basically to generate the database for us. All right? And when you work with this stuff, and I'll just leave it right here, you can use annotations. Now please take a look up on the screen here, because the author does a good job of explaining it in yellow. This does not involve using validators. And why doesn't it involve using? Because we're not writing that kind of code. So we're letting the system know by putting like required right there. It's the equivalent of us having had the database field in front of us where we could have put a required field validator. So if we leave it off, we're going to still get an error message. Okay, if we go in there and we put a string length in that's greater than 50, we're going to get an error message. All right? And that's pretty much what they talk about in here. Like I said, I know that was very general, very generic in nature. I will tell you, again, the chapters we're not covering in here. I know that Ms. Zika, when she was here, she asked you guys about security. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about what you get kind of out of the box with Model View Controller. All right, but you might want to take a look at Chapter 19 because that's on security. Chapter 20 is more on security. Do people, I'm asking here, do you know the difference between authentication and authorization? Okay, when you log in in the, when you come in, I know you've got your own machines, but let's assume you were trying to log into Rankin. In fact, let's just assume you're trying to get into Rankin to check your email. All right, when you're doing that, you are putting in your login and your password, correct? All right, so when you're doing that, you're authenticating yourself to the system. Someplace in Rankin's system, okay, they have a database that has a list of all the users and their passwords. Now, no one can see those passwords because they're stored in a format where the system, it's like if you forget your password, you can probably, let the help desk know and they can reset it, but they can't tell you what it is because of the method that they have. Now, when I log in, for instance, when I do this, and maybe you've seen this, maybe you haven't, it's no biggie, but let's see. Okay, here's like today. All right, now if I go in here and I go to academics, it's going to make me log in again. I'm logging into Inside Rankin. Okay, this is my view. And I go over to AWD1111. I'm supposed to do this every day when class starts, so you can tell I didn't. All right, and I go to today, and everybody's here, so I click Save. Boom, that's sending everything in there. All right, but the point is, I can go, for example, I can go to coursework, and this has got all the work for the class. All right, so this is my view of it. But if you notice, current view, I can go to a student view, and at any time I can see what you're seeing. In other words, I'm not seeing stuff specific to Amin, but I'm seeing a student view. All right. The reason I'm telling you that is that's authorization. You are authorized to see a student view. I am authorized to see both a student view and an instructor view. I'm also authorized that I can see the view for these two classes. AWD1000, my morning class, and AWD1111, your class. All right, next semester it'll be, It'll be AWD1100 for the C# class, and I think your class is AWD1112 for the Java class. But I can't see anything else. I can go back and look at past stuff if I need to do that. I'm authorized to do that. All right, so Chapter 20 is on authentication and authorization. Chapter 21 is on if you want to be able to build email into an application. All right, plus if you want to be able to create your own custom error pages. Then Chapter 22 is on how to deploy. But again, this is old. We're going to deploy our stuff to Azure, and I'm also working on it that hopefully next week we're going to deploy another one, and we're going to deploy that out to Amazon Web Services. If we can get those two done, I want to do a third one, all right, where we're going to deploy to a place where you can get a free account. It's a thing called App Harbor. All right, and why? Because for that one, we'll use bitbucket.org. So you'll be able to get some practice using Git, GitHub, and Bitbucket. All right, so I kind of think I've done my job as far as that goes. All right, and again, the idea is that stuff will be housed onto an actual site, your site, and they're free. The stuff is free that we're going to get. All right, but you'll be able to hopefully then just link to it directly. My suggestion is when you are updating your portfolios, you might want an ASP.NET page or pages, depending on what you want. And you might have a drop-down list or something else in there where when you choose something, it's going to go out. You might say, database project out on Amazon Web Services. Boom, they go out there and they see that. Another one, database project on App Harbor. Boom, they go out and see that one. And whatever. Database project on Microsoft Azure. And they go out and see that one. Then they know, or I think they're going to know, you understand software versioning. All right, you've done it, and you've worked with a few different packages. All right, plus you've got your stuff housed externally, so they know you know how to do that. All right, Chapter 23 is on some Ajax stuff, and those are add-ons that you can bring into the system. Chapter 24 is, in my humble opinion, the hardest chapter in the book. It's Windows Communication Foundation and Web API. So after the break, we're going to pick it back up on page 865 and on page 865, we're going to go through the last chapter in the book, an introduction to ASP.NET MVC. My guess is that after today, you won't have to bring your books anymore. I don't really know of a reason that you'll have to. Now, if you want to, of course you can. But I can't think of anything specific we're going to be grabbing out of the books after today. All right. Lastly, we're going to take a break, but before we do, last thing is please remember the Chapter 16 and the Chapter 17 homeworks are due today. So if you have not given them to me yet, you don't have to do it now, but before class ends today, please put them on a flash drive and then bring them up here. Some of you have given them to me already, and that's fine. So it's 1:41. Let's take a healthy break and come back, please, at 2 o'clock.